Thank you, Maury. Good afternoon, everybody. So I always knew Maury Dobby was an ambitious person, but now I'm thoroughly convinced. She's got us doing Grid 101 in 45 minutes. So given that we covered, climate science in 45 minutes and international policy in 45 minutes, no problem. So just to maybe set the stage, we're now transitioning kind of from some of this big picture stuff to how electricity is generated and ultimately delivered to consumers, whether they're residential, industrial, commercial, et cetera. So the grid is really the largest man-made machine, and it is complex to say the least, and that's from a technical perspective for sure. But there are other variables that make it complex as well. There's the policies that regulate how energy is produced and sold and purchased, and it varies by region, especially in this country. It's wide-ranging. There's also business models that make it complex, and again, it's how energy is bought and sold. So the technology is one piece, but then there's these other components. So we're going to be kind of looking at all of those from a technical, regulatory, and business model view. And all of those perspectives are transforming radically right now. I think the grid that we know right now will not even look familiar 10 years from now. So I have two esteemed speakers to help us navigate Grid 101 in the next 45 minutes. Our structure for this panel, we're kind of going to be mixing it up a little bit, so I'm going to do their introductions right now. So first speaking, and actually will also close us out, is Jeff Dennis, Senior Counsel at Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld in Washington, D.C. He's an expert in energy policy. And prior to his current role, he spent a decade at FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So he has his finger on the regulatory pulse and the impacts of policy at the local and federal levels. And again, he'll be speaking after I do this quick intro and then also closing us out. Scott Smith is president and CEO of Midstream Energy Holdings. He's got a diverse background in energy industry, from energy trading to market analysis to energy asset valuation and optimization, and also being an expert in natural gas and the role that natural gas plays in the transformed grid. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to really give us that overview of the Grid 101.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie, and thanks for the CSU for the invite. It's awesome to be back in the Mountain West. I'm a New Mexico guy, actually, so it's nice to be here. I was going to make some joke about the Mountain West Conference, but I don't even know who's in what conference anymore, so I'll just move on from there. But what I wanted to do, and let's see, where are the slides? Did I lose them? There we go. Did our slides not?
Yeah, you should go. You're good.
Okay.
You just go to the next one. It should be you.
Come on. This is definitely taken away from our 45 minutes. Okay, well, I'm going to start talking.
There you go.
Ah, perfect. And you're all like, he spent all that time to show us this? It's really basic, right? Well, yes, it is. But since we're doing 101, I always think it makes sense to show what I like to call the duh slide. Well, what does the electric power system look like, right? Well, so here's what it is at a basic level, right? You've got generation on the left, right? We're generating electricity. We're moving it long distances at high voltages. That's the transmission system in the middle. And then, of course, you have customers, you and I, at the end, served at different voltages and for different purposes, commercial, residential, industrial consumers. So an important thing to remember if you're going to talk about the grid for the next 2 days, there's a couple of things. So first, this whole system has to be operated in continuous balance at a frequency of 60 hertz. So what does that all mean? Well, electricity is generated and consumed almost instantaneously. We don't have a lot of storage. And so you have to constantly maintain balance of this system. So it's an important thing to remember as you're talking about the grid, and particularly how the grid is changing. Because we designed this grid around kind of some typical kinds of generation. Large central station power plants, coal-fired mostly, increasingly nuclear, increasingly natural gas. But we designed this system around those kinds of generation, and we designed it to maintain balance around that kind of generation. And so while this is a simplified scheme, another thing to think about is that within this structure, there's actually a whole lot of different products that are produced. So it's not just electricity that shows up, right? You can sort of differentiate what's on this grid. And at least from the federal level, where I've spent most of my career, we think about the products on the wholesale grid as a few different things. There's energy, the actual electrons, right, that do the work. But then there's capacity, right? That's a whole separate product that makes up the power grid. Capacity has something to do with electricity generation, but it's not what you're paid for. If you're a capacity resource, you simply exist. You are there to provide energy when called upon. And that's an important product in the market because we design the grid to make sure that we always have enough generation or other kinds of resources increasingly, and that's what we're going to talk about, to meet reliability at all times, particularly at that peak time of the year. So you have a lot of power plants sitting out there that run a fairly few hours a year, but you still have to pay for those power plants to exist. So that's another product to think about. And then there's a whole lot of other products that are produced that aren't even really electricity that is bought and sold on a market or that is consumed by end users. You have ancillary services that make all of this go, that maintain balance on the grid, that keep the grid at 60 hertz, that maintain voltage on the transmission or the distribution system. So that was a lawyer playing engineer, just like the guys in the last panel said they were playing lawyer. But that's sort of some basics to think about as you're thinking about the grid and its structure. So we have wholesale and retail markets in almost every product, and electricity is no exception. And I always show this schematic because I talk about regulation and policy, and it's important to know who regulates what. So where wholesale and where retail ends used to be a really simple proposition, right? You generated the electricity. You sold it at wholesale, right? And then it was resold at retail to you and I. So wholesalers could be any number of particular entities. It used to be solely utilities. Now there are many different competitors who are generating electricity and selling it at wholesale. Resellers used to just be your local utility, whether it was a municipal utility, an electric cooperative, an investor-owned utility. Increasingly, we have more competitive power suppliers in this business that are selling electricity as well. But that's where that shift from wholesale to retail happens. And that shift is important because it tells us who regulates what, right? And so this is a slide with a lot of words, and I won't spend a lot of time on it. I recycle it from a lot of presentations I do. But federal regulation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is focused on the wholesale market. It's focused on sales of electricity for resale in interstate commerce, as well as transmission of electricity in interstate commerce. Whereas states are focused on regulating the other half of that equation, which is retail sales, sales to you and I. One of the things we're going to talk about here a lot is how energy choices are made, choices about what kind of generation gets built to serve customers. And so I'll focus your attention on the lower right of that, of my little sort of comparison chart here. Resource planning has traditionally been within the purview of state regulators. They have traditionally worked with utilities to decide what the next megawatt of generation used to serve customers would look like. Would it be from a coal power plant? Would it be from a natural gas power plant? Or would it be from renewable resources? We'll talk a little bit later, and that's why I'm going to get back up, about how that is changing and how competitive markets are really changing that equation. But that's something that I want to focus your attention on. Also, in terms of creating this massive system, of course, everyone knows there are rules around where can you put energy infrastructure. And there are no more complicated than the electricity industry. I don't think you can find another industry that has a more complicated challenge with siting its infrastructure. And this will sort of show you that. So states hold most of the authority to site electric infrastructure. And that includes transmission lines that are actually interstate pieces of equipment and that you would think would be mostly in the purview of federal regulators. but they are not. They are mostly in the purview of state regulators, and actually in some cases, they are in the purview of individual counties within states. So imagine building a transmission line from South Dakota to Chicago. You may have to deal with not just 4 or 5 states, but maybe several counties in between. So it's a difficult challenge created by the regulatory structure we have here. And we can certainly talk more about that as we go along, but I will sit down now and jump up later.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So put a pause on the regulatory piece, and we're going to go back to the system itself, kind of the technology piece. So one of the things that's happening to the grid, and you've been hearing a lot about it today, is the entrance of all these renewable and distributed energy generation resources. So you've got wind and solar and electric vehicles and biodiesel and all kinds of things. And all of those have to be managed and controlled. Maury mentioned or asked me to talk a little bit about SPRAY, and so I'll just give you the 60-second version of that. We're all about distributed energy resources and how to manage those. Our company was founded in 2002 by Dr. Sunil Cherian, who actually got his master's and doctorate here at Colorado State University. He's actually a controls guy, a mechanical engineer. And so his fascination and vision has always been with how you can control distributed energy resources and create value where previously there was none. For many utilities and other entities who are managing generation, renewable energies and distributed energy really pose some challenges. And as the Energy Transition Symposium theme is all about challenges and opportunities, you'll hear me talk about some of those. And really what we're trying to do is flip those challenges into opportunities. I think everybody's aware that there's high variability or intermittent power. If you're depending a lot on solar and the clouds roll in, what happens to the generation? Well, it plummets really quick. Same with wind. When the wind doesn't blow, those turbines aren't generating power, so how do you manage that? And SPRAY is all about managing a large portfolio of distributed energy so you don't have that intermittency and variability. So let me, this is kind of a variation on Jeff's slide. Starting over here at the left, you have, this is kind of the traditional system, electric system, and then I'll kind of explain how we see that changing or how it is changing. So generation is on the left. Many of you are familiar with Rawhide, the coal plant up the road here. So that's where you have power being generated from coal, sent over transmission wires, then it gets converted at the distribution level, and then it's delivered to consumers. And again, that can be your home, our businesses, industry, the Budweiser plant up the street as well. So what's happening over the last few years is we're calling a new class of consumers prosumers, and you see that in the lower right. What those prosumers are doing are actually generating power. They're doing that by putting solar panels on their roof, putting a wind turbine in their backyard or on their farm. They are buying electric vehicles that they can not only plug in at home, but they can actually, in some situations, discharge power back onto the grid. So what's happening, you see some arrows, and this may be a little bit of an eye chart for you all in the back there, but what's happening is what used to be a very one-way system, both from a communications and a power flow perspective, it's now everything is two-way. And you want to talk about a challenge for utilities. This is really scary to them. One of our customers in Southern California has about 50,000 residences with solar panels on their roofs. And that can really disrupt their traditional business model, both from a reliability perspective and also from a business model perspective. So let me share with you kind of the way SPRAY is viewing the opportunity side of this. This blue box on the right side above that, what we're looking at doing is looking at more renewable and distributed energy being an opportunity, because if you aggregate all that power that's being generated at the edge of the grid, if you will, it has value. And if a utility, now I'm going to go to that middle box, has what's called a distributed energy resource management system, they can actually extract the value from all those disparate resources operate, those 50,000 residences with solar and all those electric vehicles being plugged in. And rather than crashing the grid, what happens when everybody who has an electric vehicle comes home at 5:30 and they all want to charge their car, right? You plug in, what might happen to the grid from the utility perspective? All that power trying to be extracted all at once, that creates a problem. So they're looking at creative ways to manage that power. So how can you incent consumers to actually charge their car at midnight when it's cheaper and the wind is blowing, because maybe they're drawing on the wind power at that time. So there are a lot of challenges inherent in this model. But anyway, what we're kind of looking at is raising all of that up to an area or a level where you can aggregate things virtually and create new value streams where maybe there weren't previously. So one of the things, the same utility customer that we're working with in California, their DERMS system is actually enabling them to aggregate the power generated from a set of distributed energy resources and sell it on the market, which previously they hadn't been able to do. So it's creating a new value stream for them. So that's just one example. I think, Scott, I think you have this slide in your deck as well, but I'll just briefly speak to the duck curve, because this is what this same customer is dealing with in California. I don't know if I can get the pointer to work. Maybe not. Okay, so just look at the core, the belly part of the duck. The top line there is the load, and the load is the amount of energy that is required to serve the needs of customers. During the maximum period of generation during the day, when the sun is shining, and I'm talking from a solar perspective, there's actually an overproduction of solar during that period. And so the amount of energy that's required to be drawn from the grid is actually kind of negative. So then when you move into the evening hours, there's a transition where people are not getting energy from solar anymore, and they need to get it from other sources. And that's that steep curve, kind of the throat of the duck. And that creates an immense challenge for these utilities who are trying to figure out how to ramp that up very quickly and not have damage or problems with the grid. So this is one of the issues that's very real for utilities around the country. I think California is kind of the tip of the spear, though, because of many of the regulations that have been put in place there. They're far ahead of the rest of the country in terms of their solar penetration. But this is one of the challenges that, again, companies like Spray, we're trying to flip into opportunities, because, in fact, if you manage these portfolios of distributed energy resource, you don't have this issue. So let me just close out my segment before I turn it back over to Scott. You see these Legos on the right, disparate pieces, and then you have this nicely built Lego house. That's what we're trying to move to, and that's really the transformation that's underway. And part of it is, again, that technical challenge, but there's also the regulatory piece, and then there's also this business piece that I was speaking or alluding to, of how energy is being bought and sold differently because it's being generated from different parties than it has in the past. At the end of the day, we see that creating opportunities and choice for customers in a way that's never been provided before. And we're transitioning from kilowatt hours delivered to results delivered. And we're enabling new business models, and again, just reiterating, offering energy consumers different choices for where they buy their power, if they want to produce it themselves, if they want to sell it back to the grid, et cetera, and having more control over their energy. So now I'll turn it over to Scott, who will speak to I think primarily the role that natural gas can play with some of these same challenges. Scott?
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk. So we've looked at the grid, kind of get an overview. Julie's talked about what's happening really kind of at the consumption side, what the consumers are doing and how consumers now are becoming potential generators of electricity and the complexities that that creates. I want to step back and look at what's happening not at generation side, so way upstream on the left-hand side of Jeff's diagram that he initially showed, but what's happening on the fuel side as well, because there's a whole lot of changes that are happening as far as just fuel supply to the generation mix, and that's creating some new challenges, some new opportunities for the grid as a whole. But one of the things I think it's note as a takeaway is all the new technologies that are being brought to the table, solar, rooftop solar, solar energy in general, wind, et cetera, is creating a very complex system, it's making it even more complex. And so we've talked about how energy is essentially not stored, it's consumed when generated. It's essentially physics that dictates where electrons flow across the grid. Now we're introducing completely different dynamics when we add wind generation and the variability associated with that, or different loads from the standpoint of consumers and how they utilize their cars. So what I want to do is get into some of the aspects and how that really affects upstream and the power and the generation side itself. I need to get the... Oh, that one. All right. Thanks. So first I want to just start and just setting the stage when you look at the wholesale power grid and look at the generation mix. And I have two different pieces of information here. The chart on the left just gives you a perspective of what's happening in thermal generation in the United States over the next roughly 20 or so years. When you see coal retirements occurring, and that's the blue, the dark blue, those are negative. Those are happening over the course of this period. And then the yellow is essentially gas-fired generation that's being brought on in part to replace that. We also know that solar is coming along and wind, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But you can see over the course of the next roughly 25 or so years a substantial amount of coal-related reductions in generation capacity being replaced, for the most part, by gas-fired generation. So you have this mix of gas being a small component of the generation source to becoming a much more substantive source. You look at the table on the right, that's focused on the Rockies, just to get a perspective of where we are today, where gas is roughly 20-some-odd% of the generation mix, wind is 15%. When you fast forward to 2030, all of a sudden gas now becomes 36%, wind 24%, and solar is creeping up. It's still roughly 3 or 4%. So you have this unique dynamic that we haven't observed before from the standpoint of fuel supply to the generators. What that means and how I think about it is really you think about the grid and look at two different grids. You have the power grid, which is all the generation sources of transmission and obviously what's happening on the distribution side on the right. You look on the left-hand side, that's where the generation actually occurs, and gas becoming a key, almost the main component of the generation source of fuel. And that consists of the actual production itself, the drilling of wells, and obviously gas production. You have the transmission, the pipeline network, and then you obviously have storage that's associated with that pipeline network as well. All that now is kind of coming together, and the gas-fired generator is kind of a key component or cog, if you will, creating the linkages of these two grids that occurred in the past, but nowhere near the level that we're going to be seeing moving forward. So you see now that I see it being permanently linked. I see the grid being essentially kind of a key component is relying on natural gas and natural gas fuel and generation. It's been called the bridge as a temporary bridge from moving forward, and I think its reality is a permanent bridge. It's going to be a key component of the power grid moving forward when you look at what capabilities it brings to the table, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then lastly, I want to talk about the role that storage has in this whole mix because of what happens with renewable-related generation and intermittency. This is the duct curve again that Lynn went through, and I want to highlight a couple different points. So this is a duct curve projected in California in 2030, and it reflects essentially a substantial amount of penetration by solar. It's in part driven by the RPS standards that have been adopted to California. And the two elements here that I want to take away is if you have a projected amount of sun, a projected amount of solar panels being in place in a particular utility, or in particular, in this case, California, you can see a couple different things. The blue line represents what the load looks like over the course of the day. And in this case, we're measuring basically the dollars per megawatt, which in some sense is giving you some idea of the technology that's being used to generate the electricity. Higher costs mean it's more than likely it's reflecting the variable cost of fuel. But you can see in August that curve doesn't have quite the variability that when you move into December, which is a green line, a much more substantive difference between the low point and the high point. And so the point Lynn makes is that you might be in a situation where you're generating too much power that's from solar or wind that's free. How do you manage that? But you also have the aspect of going from the low point to the high point any given day, a huge amount of ramp that the industry has to meet, whether it be from storage, whether it be electric storage, which is obviously a very, very small component, if it exists much at all, to how you ramp the thermal units up and down. And the interesting thing about this is what's expected. And what I want to roll into the mix is, well, what happens if a cloud blows through, the unexpected? Things start changing and making the life of a power utility, a generator, or a control entity much more complicated. So with that, what I want to highlight here is just two different examples. On the left is what may be of what a particular wind generation mix in a utility portfolio would look like from one day to the other. Substantive differences. I mean, this is just an example, and you can see it's not consistent. So what we may project in that duck curve of expectation, when you actually roll into the day and you start seeing what's actually happening, it's much different day to day. You have to figure out how is that difference going to be met. You have us at home turning on the light switches, turning on the TVs, and reality is generation has to be ramped up or ramped down to reflect the variability associated with wind. Solar's no different. It actually looks a little bit cleaner from the standpoint we know it doesn't. There's no sun shining at midnight, but the point being is it could be much higher or lower depending on what happens in any given weather for that day. Again, you have to basically expect this variation, and how do you have the electric grid operating such that it can basically generate electricity to make things work and keep the grid stable. The other aspect of that is you roll in storage, and this is where I think gas storage has been a key component of the gas transmission network. It's been predominantly used by gas utilities in the past, to some extent power generators, but now is growing to where a huge importance in the power generation side and for power generations itself. And so what I just showed here again is this example of uncertainty of what load may look like. On the left is when you have storage withdrawal occurring, and it's much more substantive than what you expect. You have to have excess variability to be able to pull gas out of storage, send that to the utility, send that to the generator. They in turn generate the electricity to meet whatever differences there might be in the grid. Same thing may happen on the withdrawal side when you're, on the injection side. You might see when you're planning on gas going in the ground for storage to save it for the next day, much less actually goes in the ground because the wind stopped blowing. So the whole aspect that I'm trying to highlight here is the where the grid's going, the type of resources that are being put on, and what, in particular, what's happening with an increase in gas, and then lastly, the increase in the renewable side, and the fact that we're creating a lot more uncertainty as to how things are going to operate. And then what I'm saying is, because gas is much more substantive and larger as a source of power, that balancing element that the gas generator brings to the table is much more important. Two last points, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff. One of the things is, well, storage, one key element, if just looking at an example here of a gas utility, Questar, in the general western region, it can be a lower cost alternative when a utility brings in and uses storage relative to its transmission options. So you have the ability for storage not only to gas storage in particular to meet the variability needs of the power generator, but you also have the ability for gas storage to reduce costs, which is an important element of using that resource and growing it over time. So just to close out and try to and move the panel along here, I want to highlight then, what we talked about is the growth in the gas-powered generation, the growth in the renewables, key components that are now linked because of the need for the variability of what gas generation can bring. We believe storage is going to be a key component of that. Matter of fact, we believe that the storage needs are going to grow over time as that load increases. And we also know that storage can be a cost-effective solution. So one of the elements then, as you want to think about this, is yes, we are moving to a lower carbon, footprint type platform, if you will. If we look at the generation mix that gas brings to the table, couple that with wind and solar. But you also have the elements that is providing additional services and flexibility that you have to have in the grid to keep it stable. It's just as a kind of, if you all have interest and want to understand more, out on our website at mehllc.com, there's a white paper that's been written by Black & Veatch, very well-known consulting firm, power plant construction company, that can give you more details on this. So with that, I'll let Jeff kind of close this out and answer questions. Thank you.
All right. I don't know where that came from either. So maybe just to close this out and try to get to questions in a couple of minutes here, we talked a lot about variability that's being introduced by all of these new resources, right? And different ways to manage it. There we go, thank you. And so a lot of that variability and a lot of those things get managed at the wholesale level. They get managed at the retail level too, for sure, and we can talk a little bit about that. But when it comes to bulk moving of power across the grid, from generators to consumers and how all of that gets balanced out, most of it happens at the wholesale level. And so there's a couple of things that you then want to think about is, how does that all get stitched together? What do wholesale market structures look like? Well, in this country, we don't just have one. We have a few different variations. We have a little bit of a Chinese menu of options. In the West, we rely primarily on bilateral markets, which is essentially just like markets in almost everything else that you do from day to day. It is an across-the-table transaction between me and you. You sell me power and I buy it. It's mostly done through market-based rates. FERC approves the ability of generators, suppliers, to sell at market-based rates. Some of it's done at cost-based rates as well, but most of it's done. But that's primarily a utility-managed process still in the West. Outside of California, vertically integrated utilities, just like they have for many, many years, are still the primary sellers of generation. They also primarily operate the grid. So you heard in the earlier panel that the grid is kind of three big machines, right? The West, the East, and Texas. And that's true. But then there are individual pieces of that grid that are managed by individual owners and or operators. And so your wholesale market structure may say a lot about the breadth of how big a part of the system is under one operator versus many operators. So in bilateral markets, they generally look like the utility footprint. And the utility, so Xcel has a footprint in Colorado, and they operate that footprint. And they operate it under common reliability rules with everyone else in the Western Interconnection, but they operate it alone. And to manage variability, they generally have access to the resources that are connected to their particular system and that are under their control. Well, you may have other market structures that tend to make that system much broader. So in the East, and actually 2/3 of the load in the country, are served by something called regional transmission organizations. Those are independent central operators of the grid. Individual utilities have agreed to turn over their transmission systems to the control of a central operator who independently manages that grid and also independently manages wholesale markets for the buying and selling of power in those regions. The key difference there is that they are going to be over a much broader scale. So PJM, which is the largest wholesale market by volume actually in the world, spans from Virginia all the way to Illinois. The Midwest Independent Transmission System, I'm sorry, Mid-Continent, I keep saying Midwest. Mid-Continent System Operator stretches all the way from the Canadian border to Louisiana, to New Orleans. And so they provide access to resources on a much broader scale. So in the West, what we're seeing emerging is something called an energy imbalance market, which is a little bit of a happy medium. There's been a bunch of reasons why the West has not moved to a regional transmission system organization. We could talk about those. Like a lot of things in the West, they have a lot to do with the California energy crisis. But something of a middle ground called the energy imbalance market is a way to get some of the benefits of being able to share resources over a broader region. So many utilities outside of California are sort of partnering up with California's ISO to operate sort of a more real-time market that will allow those utilities to access a broader set of different kinds of resources to manage those imbalances. So they're not just limited to what's in their own utility footprint in their own area. So those are just a few of the things. You know, the last thing I'll mention about how this all gets stitched together in Scott's presentation is we're coming to rely much, much more on the natural gas system for power generation. These two systems are being linked more than ever. They operate under completely different business models. And it's something that when I was at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we spent many, many, many years addressing and actually didn't get real far, but did get sort of to try to get those two industries coordinated. So it adds a level of complexity that we haven't seen before, and will be something that I think you'll see policy continue to work through. The last thing I'll mention, and I swear I've said that 3 times, but this really is the last thing. These market structures have an implication for how choices are made in terms of, like I talked about earlier, what that next megawatt of generation is that's going to get built. In a bilateral market where you still have many integrated utilities, state policy is the primary driver. States are still conducting something called integrated resource planning processes, where their utilities come into them and say, over the next planning horizon, over the next 10 years, this is the set of resources I plan to use to serve my customers. In RTO ISO markets, states have either by choice or by accident kind of given up some of that authority, and they've really allowed the market to start making those choices based on what's the lowest marginal cost resource. States in those regions obviously still have policies, they still have renewable portfolio standards and other things, but how those are integrated into the market is a challenge. And something that has really dominating a lot of time at the federal level these days is how do you allow states to continue to operate those policies in a multi-state market where one state's policy may have a lot of impacts on another state. I think I left us 6 minutes for questions.
Maury, do you want to let us know if we've got questions?
Your hands for a question. Here's one. Is it a good one? Oh, you hope so?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, in the last year we've seen many reports, also a book was written about the security, particularly of the western states grid. Could you comment on that, please?
Oh, okay. Okay. I can't really comment on the entire Western region. I can only speak to it from, as a software vendor company, that security is inherently addressed in what we do. It is critical, and it has to be, we always talk about the Swiss cheese approach. You have to stack lots of pieces of Swiss cheese because you got holes in in every layer, and you have to make sure there aren't penetrations or that at some point the holes are covered up, and that's how we approach it. But I don't know. Can either of you speak to it from a system view?
I think what I would say is what's interesting about cybersecurity and those kind of issues is that in a lot of ways for the electric utility industry, they're not a lot different than for any other IT application. It's a constantly evolving threat, and you have to constantly be managing it. The threat here in the West, I don't think, is any different than anywhere else in the country. One of the challenges for the electric utility industry has been the industry generally operates and abides by a common set of standards by which they will operate, called reliability standards, interestingly enough. But cybersecurity isn't something that you can just develop a standard for and say, oh, yeah, we're done, let's go have a beer, right? It changes all the time. And so that's really been one of the primary struggles. Another big struggle for the utility industry has been they don't necessarily always know the nature of the threat to their assets. And a lot of times, the government can't tell them because it's classified. And so that's been a big debate on Capitol Hill and in Congress about how do you get the information that utility operators need to be able to manage these threats without compromising national security.
I think we have time for one more. Anybody? Here's a hand raised.
Mr. Smith, you talked about natural gas being something that's going to be a permanent part of this transition to more renewable energy versus kind of a temporary fix. I'm just curious about, is there discussion about when we, at some point in the future when we don't have the natural gas, how the grid would operate and what would replace natural gas to keep this system working?
Well, I think the issue that you're getting to gets down to, and this is something that's happened over the last 10 years, is the resource itself. And it's created quite a bit of debate in the United States, fracking, disposal of frack water, et cetera. But essentially that shale resource of natural gas is huge to the extent that it can supply the United States for decades. And then on top of that, there's other resources that have not even been tapped. Hydrates, methane hydrates that are at the bottom of the ocean. That again, more sources of natural gas that have not been tapped yet. So, not to say that it's an infinite resource, excuse me, but I think that the point being is over the next 40, 50 years, there's definitely the opinion that there's substantial or sufficient resources available to fuel the gas demand in the United States. Now, obviously, demand changes could affect that. The type of penetration we see with renewables, et cetera, is going to change that. But I think my lifetime and my kids, gas will be a predominant resource for gas generation.
Do you want to wrap it, or do you have anything else?
There's still a minute or so.
Yeah, you have a
we can take
minute.
another
Come on,
question.
take advantage. Do it. No, do it. Any questions? There's one way back there.
All right.
And I'll never get back there in time.
Can you yell?
Yell your question, young man.
So concerning solar, why doesn't it increase as much as, for example, wind and natural gas? Why are we predicting it to increase?
Can you repeat that? Did you hear him?
Was the question, why are we projecting it to increase not as much?
Solar?
Yeah.
Well, I think that just the issue, you have to put it in context of, that was a study projecting out to 2030. It's projected, and my understanding of how, I think it was Black and Veatch that conducted that, used basically what they believe is the cost of installing solar panels versus the cost of wind, et cetera. And right now, solar is a more expensive resource than wind, more expensive than gas-fired generation. So that tends to limit the amount of penetration and growth in solar. That said, you have states like California saying we're going to mandate a much higher penetration, up to 50% of renewables. The bulk of that's got a significant amount of that's going to be solar. So that element is hard for some of the economic forecasters to model. So some of that, it really isn't built in. I think reality is you probably could factor in that it's going to be on the lower side, given that we do see states and other regulatory bodies mandating a greater focus on bringing renewables into the mix.
And I would just say, but keep track of those projections like every 6 months, because they change dramatically because technology moves so fast. And Scott will tell you, gas, he wouldn't have been saying the same thing about gas, 7 years ago when it was $15 an MMBTU.
Yeah, I was just going to add the same thing. Technology, it changes extremely rapidly, exponentially, and so everything could flip-flop in 2 years.
Please help me thank this panel.